Okay, so have you ever, like, been in a situation where you're leading a team and, like, everything's hitting the fan?
Uh-huh.
Like, you got deadlines looming, the market's shifting, and everyone's looking to you to make the call.
Right.
Like, how does that pressure change the way you make decisions?
Yeah.
Do you get more cautious, or do you, like, find yourself taking bigger risks?
It's a really interesting question, and it's one that I think any leader grapples with. And today we're actually looking at some research that sheds light on that exact question, how stress and uncertainty affect decision-making, particularly when it comes to identifying threats.
Yeah, here's where it gets really cool. They used a virtual reality simulation to put actual soldiers in a scenario where they had to identify friend or foe,
Oh,
while under the threat of electric shock.
it allowed them to really isolate the effects of stress in a controlled environment and get some pretty surprising insights into how people react under pressure.
So, okay, before we get to the zapping part, I think it's important to kind of set the stage. The study focuses on military personnel, but I think what they're looking at, the findings apply to basically anyone who deals with high-stakes decisions.
Absolutely. And to understand those implications, I think it's good to take a step back and look at the existing research on stress and cognitive performance, because there's a lot of debate about how those two things interact.
So is it as simple as stress makes us worse at thinking and decision-making, or is there more to it?
There's definitely more to it. Some studies actually show that stress can improve performance on certain tasks, particularly ones that require quick reaction times.
Interesting.
But other research suggests that it can also impair memory, attention, and even our ability to accurately assess risk.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's no easy answer, which I guess is why they decided to do this study. What were they trying to figure out specifically?
So they had two key questions they were really trying to get at. The first was, how does the threat of physical discomfort in this case? Those electric shocks affect soldiers' physiological and cognitive responses under pressure. The second question was, how does uncertainty add to the mix? So they actually designed this virtual reality scenario to include varying levels of ambiguity, making it harder or easier to distinguish friend from foe.
So like they're trying to create a virtual pressure cooker to see how our brains and bodies react.
Yeah, exactly. They wanted to understand not just as stress impairs performance, but how that impairment might manifest in different situations, particularly when there's uncertainty involved.
So walk me through this. How do they actually pull this off? Did they round up a bunch of soldiers, stick them in VR headsets and start zapping them?
Well, not exactly. There were strict ethical protocols in place, and these soldiers volunteered to participate.
Right.
But they did have each participant go through a calibration process to determine their individual tolerance for the shocks. And the researchers made sure that the shocks delivered during the actual experiment were always below that predetermined maximum.
Okay, so there were some safety measures in place,
Yes.
but it still sounds pretty intense. So what about the virtual reality setup itself? What were the soldiers actually doing in there?
They used a program called DMUS, which stands for Decision Making Under Uncertainty and Stress.
Okay, I do love a good acronym. So what does DMIUS actually involve? Like, what are they doing in there?
So the soldiers were placed in this virtual environment that mimics a combat scenario. They have to identify approaching avatars as either friendly or hostile based on their camouflage patterns. And here's the twist. The clarity of those patterns was manipulated to create different levels of uncertainty.
So sometimes it's super clear who's who, and other times it's more of a judgment call.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And to add to the pressure, they knew that if they misidentified a target, like they shot a friendly or let an enemy get too close, they would get a little jolt from that shock belt.
Okay, so you got this decision-making under pressure, you got this physical discomfort element, and then you have the uncertainty. I can see why they use soldiers. They're trained to operate in these high-stress environments.
Absolutely. But remember, the point wasn't just to study soldiers. It's to understand how these fundamental processes, stress, uncertainty, and decision-making, how they interact in any high-pressure situation. And the findings are relevant to leaders across really any domain.
Okay, I am totally hooked. So tell me, what did they find? It's especially those unexpected results you were talking about.
Well, before we jump into the cognitive stuff, let's talk about the physiological responses. So they tracked things like heart rate, cortisol levels, and alpha amylase, which is another stress hormone. And as you might imagine, heart rates went up across the board during the simulation, especially when those shocks were involved.
Yeah, that makes sense. Your heart's probably racing when you're waiting to get zapped. But what about cortisol and alpha amylase? Did those spike too?
And that's where it gets a little surprising, because despite the increased heart rate, there were no statistically significant differences in cortisol or alpha amylase levels between the shock and no-shock conditions.
Wait, so their bodies are clearly reacting to the threat, but their stress hormone levels aren't spiking? What's going on there?
Right. It kind of challenges some of our assumptions about how stress works. One possible explanation is that the predictability of the shocks played a role. Because the shocks only happened after errors, the soldiers knew what to expect, and that predictability may have actually reduced the overall stress they were experiencing.
So it's not just the intensity of the stressor, but also how predictable it is. That's so interesting. It makes you wonder if there are ways to manage stress by making things more predictable, even in chaotic environments.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and it's actually something we'll come back to when we talk about the practical applications of this research. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's look at how the soldiers actually performed on the cognitive tasks. Did the stress actually affect their ability to make those split-second decisions, particularly when there was uncertainty about who was friend and who was foe?
What did they find?
So remember how we talked about the research on stress and cognitive performance being kind of mixed? Well, this study adds to that complexity. The results were definitely surprising in some ways, and they really highlight the nuance of this relationship between stress, uncertainty, and decision-making. They looked at a number of cognitive measures. First, they looked at the soldiers' accuracy in identifying friend versus foe in that shoot, don't shoot task. And that's where some of those surprising findings start to emerge.
What happened? Did the stress make them worse at identifying threats?
You'd think so, but it's not that straightforward. It turns out the threat of shock didn't actually make them less accurate overall.
Really?
They were still pretty good at telling friend from foe, even with that jolt of electricity hanging over their heads.
So the stress didn't, completely mess with their ability to read the situation.
Right. It's surprising. You'd think that pressure would lead to more mistakes. But here's the thing. While the threat didn't impact their overall accuracy, it did make them react way faster. Even when they said they felt less confident about their decision.
Hold on. They were quicker to pull the trigger, but they weren't even sure if they were aiming at the right person. That's kind of terrifying, especially in a real combat situation.
Yeah, it definitely raises some concerns, and it suggests that under pressure, people might prioritize speed over being certain.
Wow.
Even when the stakes are super high.
That's kind of unsettling, to be honest. Makes you wonder if that instinct to act fast, even when you're not totally sure, is like a human thing, not just a soldier thing.
That's a really interesting thought, and the researchers actually talked about that in their discussion. They suggested that this bias toward quick action could be rooted in our evolution, like a fight or flight response.
Oh, like our caveman brains kicking in.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Something that helped our ancestors avoid predators. But in today's world where threats are more complex and the consequences of a mistake can be way bigger, that quick action bias can really backfire.
So it's like our brain saying better to act fast and maybe be wrong than to hesitate and get caught off guard.
Precisely.
This is making me think about my own decisions under pressure. Easy to assume I'm being all rational and objective, but maybe there are these subconscious biases I'm not even aware of.
I think we all have those biases. This research just helps bring them to light. The good news is that once we know about them, we can start to figure out how to lessen their impact.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we avoid falling into that trap of acting too quickly without thinking things through, especially when we're stressed out?
Well, one of the big takeaways from this study is the importance of slowing down and getting as much information as you can before making a decision, especially when things are uncertain.
But isn't that easier said than done? When you're in a leadership role, people are looking to you for answers. You feel that pressure to be decisive.
Absolutely. It's tough to resist that urge to act quickly, but this research really highlights that taking a pause, even if it's just for a few seconds, can really make a difference.
So it's about being more mindful, more deliberate in how we approach decision-making.
Exactly. And there are a few things you can do to build that mindfulness. First, try to become aware of how you react to stress. How does your body feel? Do you tense up? Do you start talking faster?
I definitely talk faster.
Once you know those patterns, you can start to manage them.
So if I know I get tunnel vision when I'm stressed, I can remind myself to zoom out and look at the big picture, get different perspectives.
Exactly. That's a great example. Another helpful strategy is to make a decision checklist for yourself. A set of questions to ask before you make any big calls, especially when you're feeling the pressure.
Okay, like what kind of questions?
It depends on the situation, but some general ones might be, what are the possible consequences of this decision? What don't I know? Have I gathered enough information, or do I need to dig deeper?
So it's about forcing yourself to stop and think critically, even when your gut's telling you to jump in and just do something.
Exactly. And sometimes the best decision is to not decide at all, to wait until you have more info or until things calm down a bit.
That's a good point. It's easy to feel like you always have to have an answer ready, but sometimes the smartest move is to say, I need more time.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to another key, finding the impact of uncertainty on our decisions. Remember how they messed with the clarity of the camouflage in the VR simulation?
Yeah, to see how that ambiguity would affect their judgment.
Right. And this is where it gets really interesting because they found a clear link between uncertainty and what they call cognitive bias. Essentially, when the soldiers were dealing with those fuzzy, hard to make out patterns, they were more likely to say a target was a threat, even if it meant a bigger chance of accidentally shooting a friendly hole.
So the less certain they were, the more likely they were to shoot first and ask questions later.
Yeah, and that's a pretty scary thought, especially in a situation where a mistake could be devastating. It really highlights how uncertainty can warp our perception and influence our choices. The researchers suggested this shoot-first bias might be built into military training, where the focus is often on taking out threats and self-preservation. But they also said it could be a more general human response to uncertainty, like a primal instinct to err on the side of caution when the stakes are high.
So even if we're not trained soldiers, we might still have that knee-jerk reaction to see something unclear as a threat.
It's definitely possible, and something to be mindful of, especially in leadership roles where we often have to make decisions with incomplete information.
We talked a lot about the shoot, don't shoot task, but they also had the soldiers do those other cognitive tests.
Yeah.
The ones with memory and spatial orientation. Did stress affect how they did on those too?
That's a great question, and it actually leads to another surprising finding. So get this, the threat of shock didn't mess with their performance on the memory tasks or the spatial orientation tests.
Wait, really? I would thought for sure stress would make it harder to remember things or like find your way around.
I know it seems counterintuitive. The researchers think the timing of the stress might be a big factor. Here they were only zapping the soldiers during the tasks, not while they were first learning the information.
So maybe there's a difference between like getting zapped while you're studying a map versus getting zapped when you're trying to remember it later.
Yeah, it's like trying to take a test in a calm, quiet room versus trying to remember everything while you're sitting there all stressed out during the exam.
Oh yeah, I can definitely relate to that.
The other thing they brought up is the idea of individual differences in how we respond to stress. Some people just handle pressure better than others. It's possible that the soldiers who were more resilient to stress didn't have the same cognitive issues as the ones who were more sensitive.
Makes sense. Even in a group as highly trained as soldiers, you're going to have a whole spectrum of responses to stress.
Absolutely. That just shows how important it is to remember that everyone on your team might react differently to pressure.
Okay, so we've covered a lot today. We talked about heart rates and hormones and virtual reality combat and some really interesting insights into how stress and uncertainty can really mess with our decision-making. But what does all this mean for those of us who aren't dodging virtual bullets or getting zapped with electricity?
The really cool thing here is that even though this study was done with soldiers, the basic principles apply to anyone who makes decisions under pressure. Think about it. High-pressure situations where you don't have all the information are pretty much the norm these days. So that shoot-first bias we were talking about could show up in different ways.
Right, like a CEO making a risky investment or a manager jumping to conclusions about an employee's performance without getting all the facts.
Exactly. That tendency to see ambiguity as a threat and act impulsively, it can be just as harmful in the boardroom as it is on the battlefield.
Okay, this is hitting a little too close to home. Knowing that these biases are out there, is there anything we can do to fight them? Or are we just destined to make bad decisions when the pressure's on?
No way we're not destined to make bad decisions. Awareness is a huge first step. Just by knowing how stress and uncertainty can cloud our judgment, we can start to figure out how to make better choices, even when things are crazy.
So it's about building up our mental resilience to stress, like learning to stay calm and collected when everything's hitting the fan.
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. Mindfulness training, breathing exercises, even just taking a minute to pause and collect your thoughts before making a decision can all help. But there are some cognitive strategies we can use too.
Like what? Give me some tips.
Well, one technique is called cognitive reappraisal. It's basically about reframing a stressful situation in a more positive light. So instead of seeing a challenge as an overwhelming threat, try to see it as a chance to grow or learn something new.
So like changing our mindset, flipping the script on those negative thoughts.
Exactly. Another powerful tool is seeking out different perspectives. When we're stressed, we tend to get tunnel vision, focusing only on our own point of view. But by talking to other people, getting more information, and looking at things from different angles, we can make better choices.
It's like two heads are better than one, especially when those other heads can offer new insights and challenge our assumptions.
Right. Collaboration and open communication are key when things are stressful. And finally, don't underestimate the power of being prepared. The more we can anticipate challenges and come up with backup plans, the better we'll be able to handle them when they do pop up.
So it's about building up our mental toolkit, equipping ourselves with the skills to navigate those high-pressure situations. This has been such an eye-opening conversation. We've learned about how stress affects our brains and bodies, and we've got some really valuable tools for making better decisions, even when the stakes are high.
What's really cool is that these skills aren't something you're born with. They can be learned and practiced. Just like those soldiers trained for combat, we can all train our minds to be more resilient, adaptable, and effective under pressure.
That's a great point. Before we wrap up, I have one final thought for our listeners. Think about a time when you had to make a tough decision under pressure. How did you handle it? What influenced your choice? Were there any biases you noticed? Taking a moment to think about our own experiences is a great way to find areas where we can improve and work on those crucial decision-making skills.
I completely agree. Reflection is key to understanding our own patterns and tendencies.
Well, that brings us to the end of another deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of stress, uncertainty, and the amazing resilience of the human mind. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and try to stay stress-free